The week behind, the English ship erupted with cannon fire, but the escape was too swift. In his quarters, one Captain Gibson arose from a sickly and drunken slumber, alarmed that the ship was moving. For 6 months, the English crew of Gibson's Spanish-backed privateering expedition had suffered at anchor, awaiting documentation, deprived of the meager wages they had been promised. Gibson staggered to the quarterdeck, finding at the helm his own first mate, Henry Avery. Gibson demanded to know where the ship was headed, to which the bold Avery replied, "I am the captain of the ship now, and this is my cabin. Therefore, you must walk out. I am bound to Madagascar with the design of making my own fortune and that of all the brave fellows joined with me." Honest sailing had promised the crew long and oppressive voyages for paltry food and wages. And so, sending Gibson and 16 others away in a small boat, Avery and 80 mutinous associates set a course for Madagascar, where ordinary men of their lot might seize their fortune with sword and pistol. Indeed, a fellow Englishman named Thomas too adventured there and built his legend, plundering the treasures of the Indian Ocean. Renaming their ship the Fancy, the pirates sailed first to the tropical waters of Cape Verde to procure provisions. There, Captain Avery raided 3 English merchant vessels for salt beef and fish and presented to their impoverished crews an appealing arrangement if they joined him. Pirate code stipulated their loot should be divided in clear and equal shares, and unjust captains could be voted out. Avery's own power was checked by that of his quartermaster, Joseph Dawson. 9 of the English sailors came aboard, and soon the pirates cruised into the turquoise waters of West Africa. Captain Avery knew this so-called slave coast well. After a stint in the Royal Navy, he had made a living here purchasing people from African chiefs and often stealing those slave traders as well. Men and women had begged for mercy as well. Avery shackled them below deck to starve and wallow in their own waste. Months later, he would haul out the survivors to be sold into suffering the rest of their lives on plantations in the West Indies. Now, Henry Avery returned to this coast under different pretenses. He raised the English flag at a verdant harbor, and a group of Guinean villagers soon paddled out and came aboard to trade. The pirates robbed them of their gold, muskets, machetes, and sold them all into slavery. The crew continued south, stopping to remove extraneous decks from the ship, such that the Fancy became one of the fastest vessels on the Atlantic. With newfound speed, Avery chased down 2 Danish privateering ships, letting loose a violent torrent of cannon fire. The Danes surrendered and relinquished 40 pounds of gold, chests of fine fabrics, ivory, guns, and 50 large casks of brandy. 17 privateers joined the crew. Now, months into the journey, the Fancy reached cool winds which carried her past pods of breaching whales and around the Cape of Good Hope, and the crew at long last spotted a distant and friendly harbor. The shores of Madagascar were host to seafaring colonies of thieves and killers, pirate dens. The men found their land legs ashore, merrily gorging themselves on the stolen brandy. The crew explored clinging jungles in the coming months and encountered Malagasy natives who traded them cattle for guns. There was risk in venturing far from these shores, for England's East India Company patrolled these seas. Its well-armed ships annually delivered England's fortune in tea, textiles, and spices from Indonesia, China, Persia, and the great Mughal Empire of India. Exponential profits lined the petticoat pockets of English nobles, such that the East India Company became at once a private trade monopoly and a formidable nation-state acting on behalf of the King of England, violently claiming foreign territory with its own mercenary army and navy. Threats to the company's trade from competitors or pirates would be punished. 3 company ships caught sight of the Fancy after Avery had raided a French pirate ship and recruited 40 of her crew. They gave chase but reported that the modified Fancy sails so hard now that she fears not to follow her. The ship will undoubtedly go into the Red Sea, which will procure infinite clamors in India. Indeed, from the mouth of the Red Sea, a pilgrim fleet was to return from Mecca, laden with treasures and concubines from the Islamic world, bound for India, whose elegant ruling classes adorned themselves with gemstones and gold. The largest and most prized vessel in the convoy belonged to the Mughal emperor himself, Aurangzeb, and it was called the Ganji Sawai, or the Gunsway. Rounding the Horn of Africa, Avery sailed to the ports of Made, Somalia. The locals rebuffed his offers to trade, so the pirates set fire to the town. Civilians scattered, and it was recorded that Avery took revenge by demolishing their sacred mosque. He proceeded to the volcanic island of Perim in August of 1695 to await the Mughal treasure fleet, where he discovered 5 other pirate crews had arrived with the same intentions. At the helm of one ship called Amity was the legend himself, Thomas II. The captains convened in a boisterous pirate council, whereupon they pledged to honor Henry Avery as the captain of a combined pirate fleet. 6 ships and over 400 men. Nightfall provided cover for the Mughal fleet, and the convoy snuck into the open ocean, but its most fearsome and treasure-laden ships, the Fatma and the Gunsway, still lagged behind. The pirates gave chase. Thomas II was killed in the battle. Avery launched another volley. One fateful cannonball struck the main mast of the Gunsway. The rigging toppled and splintered as Avery's ships pulled closer. Pirates began to scale the Gunsway from all sides. They charged through desperate plumes of gun smoke and wildly locked swords with the legal defenders. After hours of battle, the Gunsway capitulated. Avery watched his pirates burn and torture Indian sailors until they confessed to the location of all the treasure hidden aboard. Gaping corpses decorated the bleeding deck. The pirates committed heinous acts against the passengers, leading some to take their own lives to escape their fate. Tons of shining emeralds, Arabian gold, ivory, and silk were carried proudly from the scene of the slaughter to the Fancy. This was perhaps the most valuable treasure ever stolen. Avery took his massive share, and Quartermaster Dawson divided the remainder, over a lifetime of sailors' wages for each man. The defiled Gunsway returned to port some days after the attack. The Mughals demanded justice and blamed the East India Company for the plague of English pirates in their seas. Seeking to preserve commercial interests, England and the company sought to capture Sir Avery and absolve themselves of guilt, but he was lost to the open seas. The pirates stopped briefly to purchase 90 slaves near Madagascar, and later to hunt sea turtles before traversing the Atlantic. 7 months later, the Fancy sailed into the quiet backwater bay of Nassau. Avery posed as a slave trader and bribed the governor with chests of gold and the Fancy itself in exchange for safe hiding. For weeks, the pirates exchanged coin for rum in the decrepit taverns of Nassau. But in due time, proclamations from the Lords Justices spread across the seas. We do hereby charge and command all His Majesty's admirals, captains, and other officers at sea to seize and take Henry Avery and such as are with him on the ship to be punished as pirates upon the high seas. An enormous bounty was set, and the crew of the Fancy disbanded. Some stayed in Nassau, most headed for corrupt ports of the 13 colonies. Captain Avery purchased a small ship with some of his men and returned to sea. Then, in the green fields of Ireland, Avery broke from his crew, told some he was going on to Scotland alone, others he told England. The fate of Henry Avery became, in the coming years, a tale told on pirate decks, a sailor's story belted in shanty taverns or scrawled in the dubious pages of popular books. Some said Avery squandered his wealth, or that he loved a Mughal princess, or that he now governed a free colony of pirates on Madagascar. Evidence for his whereabouts never came. The same year, Avery disappeared. Joseph Dawson and a handful of the crew who had returned to Britain were paraded to execution dock in London to answer for their crimes. One of the pirates told the eager crowds that the crew deserved death and that the inhuman treatment and merciless tortures inflicted on the poor Indians and their women still affects my soul. It appeared to some that in their slaving and murder and mistreatment of innocents, the pirates had not betrayed some heroic code, but rather exposed those very bloated professions of libertine spirits as tawdry platitude. Maritime atrocities styled as plucky resistance slowly strangled on what news existed. The corpses were left to dangle in the tide and wither into ghoulish forms on the gray coast. Elsewhere in some unseen corner of the world was Henry Avery and his share of the treasure, never found. How did violent fugitives like Henry Avery and Blackbeard become known as romantic heroes, adventurers? It's part of their Britain's Outlaws series that really shows how those swashbuckling elements of gold, cannons, and murder captivated and appalled people at that time too. I always love to actually see what the places and weapons and so on look like of an era, and this documentary really delivered.